Hi, this is Soren with Wisdom 2.0. I'm excited to introduce the next interview in our series with longtime meditation and loving kindness teacher Sharon Salzberg. Sharon is the author of many books, most recently, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. She is interviewed by David Simas, the CEO of the Obama Foundation. Enjoy.
Well, what a joy it is to be here with Sharon Salzberg. Sharon, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so great to see you.
It's good to see you. It's been a long time, and a lot has transpired since I think you and I were in a green room in the back of the big hall a few months ago. And so, how have you been? Where have you been? Tell me a little bit before we really dig in about what life has been like for you and during this global pandemic.
Actually, I saw you one more time after that. You were in New York City. We were at a luncheon together.
Right.
It must have been early March because I spent all of February in California, and then I flew back and went to just a few things. That was one of the only social gatherings I went to. And at that point, the advice was just like bump elbows, don't shake hands. And there we were. And soon after that, I was in New York City, and I just started feeling, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. So this is before everything shut down. And I have a home in Barre, Massachusetts, and a retreat center. And I thought, I'll just go up to Barre for a couple of weeks. So I came up here March 14th with my snow boots and like no summer clothes. And I'm here. So in so many ways, I'm safe, I'm protected, I'm privileged, and I am teaching as much as possible. Sometimes I look back and I think, how did I add travel to this? This is really a lot, all in and of itself. So yeah, it's an extraordinary time.
Sharon, you have devoted a substantial portion of your life to working with people who help others, working with people who relieve suffering, who are the first responders. You're in Barre, and there are now hundreds of thousands of first responders, whether they have the title or not. Tell me about the teaching that you have been doing and the healing that you have been doing remotely from Barre with this cohort of first responders that in some ways we've all become.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have all become. I mean, I think one of the powers of the meditation practice, and there's several that I feel really lucky to have practiced, for some time, is really the sense of inclusion. Who's usually not seen, who's overlooked, who's in some way discounted, and who's taken for granted, which is a big element here. So I was speaking not long ago to the head of a medical practice, the head of a hospital, and he said to me, who I'm really appreciating for the first time? It's the cleaning staff. And so I think we're in a world which hopefully will open us up to ever more clearly seeing the truth of interconnection. So I've been working with a group of international humanitarian aid workers who were really struggling in many ways because first they say couldn't get back into the Syrian refugee camps, or their funding was being withdrawn. Their very deepest sense of mission was being thwarted. And it was quite international, so that was interesting because everyone was in a different phase of lockdown or grieving or whatever it was. I've been working a lot with medical personnel, including ambulance drivers and people like that. And, I've been working to some extent with home health aides, which is really close to my heart. Really the kind of people who are normally overlooked. And it means a lot to me to be able to stay in touch and to be able to just try to provide some tools.
And is there any difference, in those interactions that you're having with people who are on the front lines now than from in the past? Or is the suffering pretty uniform?
I think it's, well, of course, to some extent, the suffering is always uniform, because
Yeah.
it's human life, but there's a degree of anxiety. There's also, uh, I think of the ambulance drivers, for example, there's
Mm.
sometimes a degree of anger. Because I always ask the organizers, what do you think might be helpful? What do you think people want to hear? And I remember I was going to work with this group of EMT people and ambulance drivers, and the organizer said to me, they are so angry. They see
Mm.
people not wearing masks and they are so angry. And I thought, wow, if I were an ambulance driver and I saw people walking around without masks, I think, 10 more days,
Right.
and your life might be in my hands and my life might be really at risk, And so um, helping people to uh, also take care of themselves, I mean, it's interesting for me because I think we live in a world where empathy training is getting more pronounced, and it's so desperately needed.
Mm.
We see the cruelty and the callousness and just the coldness of people who don't seem to have real empathy for others. But this is a group that has lots of empathy.
Mm.
They care deeply, but they're burning out for other reasons. It's um, extraordinary expectations, not thinking about themselves, thinking that, well, that's selfish. I can't really do that. Um, Having a sense of um, overwhelming responsibility, way beyond
Mm.
what a human being can accomplish. There's so many other factors. And so I feel
Mm.
like I'm holding both things at once. It's like the appreciation of empathy and hoping that as a trait it can really get more pronounced, and the realization that, okay, here are people who they don't need that training, they
Right.
need support and recognition other ways.
And in a crisis like this, it's usually that selflessness um, that um, that takes over, and that's where people begin to burn the candle in ways that just isn't sustaining. The other thing about this moment, at least for me, that I've seen, Sharon, and I'd love to hear if you have seen it and your reflections on it, if you have, um, the inability to be with someone in pain, the images of people looking through a window in a hospital room and not being able to touch their loved one is something that is really extra painful. Have you seen it? Have you engaged with it? Tell me the way you have viewed that piece of this.
Well, yeah, I'll get to that in a minute, but the other side of that is the
Mm.
incredible moral injury or the soul wounds for the doctors and nurses in that
Mm.
situation, who are the ones who have to say goodbye. They're the ones holding the iPhone, or whatever, so that the family can talk to the person who's actually dying. And
Wow.
I think about them so much, not only because I, work with them or care for them, but can you imagine? I have a friend who's like just a little bit older than I am. And right in the beginning of the pandemic, she said to me, you know what? I don't think I'm going to get a ventilator if I go into the hospital. And I thought about it and I thought, you know what? I won't either. And so you can imagine making that decision. And I mean, the grievous wound that has been inflicted on these people is very significant. So that's just the other side, and the side that I'm more in touch with,
Connected with. Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I went to a friend's Zoom birthday party yesterday. He was turning 86. He turned 86. And it was like a drop-in thing. So I tuned in, and there were like all these little squares on the screen of different people. And um, it's sort of like Hollywood squares. And then somebody asked something like, what are you looking forward to? Like, how's your experience of the pandemic been? And my 86-year-old friend said, I don't look forward to anything. I'm just living in the moment, And it was like, great. But there was an artist who spoke, and she said, for the first 3 months, I couldn't make art, and she was afraid to leave her apartment. She was also of an age, and she said, now I go to my studio every single day and I make art, and I feel a measure of peace that I didn't feel before. And as she was speaking, I was looking at this other little square, this face of a person I know whose father died in those circumstances you described very early on. And she couldn't visit, and she couldn't make contact except through some other medium. And I kept watching her as this woman was describing the peace that she now was enjoying. And it was a gathering where love was very present. So there was room for everybody and their own personal experience. But I kept looking at her and the sadness and sorrow, because she will never have that time back, where she can sit and hold her dad's hand or whatever. It's so painful. And I think for us as human beings, we have to be able to bear witness if we're not in the immediate situation. But it's also, there's some balance, it's like, I was interviewed for the New York Times, actually. One of my colleagues had recommended me, and the topic was doom scrolling, which I had never heard of before. It's just like scrolling through horrible story after horrible story after horrible story after horrible story after horrible story. So first of all, it was a new word, which I really liked. And then when the article came out, my colleague was not in it and I was. So then I thought, why did she recommend me? Did she know I do it? She doesn't do it, but I'm like there, So it is very tempting to do that. And we need to do some of it, not to the point where it can be called a doom scroller perhaps, but we need to be open. We need to bear witness. And at the same time, there's goodness in this world, and there are good things that are happening. And there are people, even going back to the doctors and nurses who are sure to try to make that message happen. They don't say I'm too busy. There is so much goodness, and we have to, I think, make room for that as well.
Yeah. Sharon, I had not thought about that. But the image of a doctor or a nurse in a room holding a phone, and at that moment in time, they are channeling pain, almost as if it's going through them from multiple places in a way that when you do that day after day after day after day, thank goodness that you are doing the work and have been doing the work with a mind to them. And so thank you for that. Sharon, you've written many, many books, and thank goodness for that.
Thank you.
You have a new book that's about to hit, as they say, written pre-pandemic, released post-pandemic. So before you get into what changes, if any, or a different way of looking at it, the first thing I want to know, just from you as a writer, when you sat down to write Real Change, what is it that you wanted to share with the world? What is the theme or the image or the set of values that you said, you know what, this needs to be out into the world right now? So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, the world in general, if they know me at all, they know me as a meditation teacher. And there's a part of me that's always, I think, been politically active and really engaged in various ways. And in my heart, in my mind, it's the natural extension of compassion. That there's movement toward not being sure you can be of help, but I don't see how a sense of inclusivity or an acknowledgement of interconnection can lead otherwise, and that may not look like kind of classic protests or even political action, but there's something in one's art, in one's creativity, in one's family, in one's work, which is bringing that to life. And for me, that has always had a kind of political form, and not partisan, I should hasten to add, but political, as you know, as some friends of mine know, and some students of mine know, I have like a passion for people voting. And actually, I learned something from you sitting in that green room the second to last time we saw each other, which was when you said to me, voting is not enough. Citizenship is really the point, which I'm still pondering. But I wrote the book in part because I wanted to highlight all that. I wanted to bring it to life. Like, how do we live? You know, how are these values that maybe we've nourished and we've cared about so much? You know, how do they manifest? And so I have, and the obstacles or the challenges. You know, I have a chapter on finding agency when we feel hopeless. I have a chapter on moving from anger to courage. I have a chapter on moving from grief to resilience. So I look at it now and I think, whoa, you know, like that was really good. The other part of it, of course, is that everything except the brand new preface was written even pre-pandemic, let alone protests. And so I, some friend of mine was reading it in order to excerpt it, and he said to me, he kept looking at those examples and thinking, that's what made you anxious? Wait till you see what's coming, you know? And so I asked the publisher, would it be okay if I write a new preface, and just to kind of ground it in this time? And they said yes. And so I did. And then the protests happened, but it was too late. I thought, I can't go back to them, you know? I have to hope that it's relevant.
Will be in the second edition.
Right.
Sharon, there is a wonderful mural at Faneuil Hall in Boston, and the words "liberty and union." And in some ways, when you think about American history and American political history, there has always been this tension between the primacy of the individual me, the rugged individualism that makes, in the eyes of some, this country, and the union. That we can only do things together, the me and the we, in some ways in constant tension, and you see it play it out in a variety of different ways. When you mention there is a chapter on agency, one of the critiques of meditation that I have heard from some friends and colleagues of mine who don't have a practice say that they view it as an escape from the world around you, a simple focus on me and my self-improvement, and a detachment from everything around. And so in many ways, this book speaks directly to that. But how would you respond to those people who say that this is, at its core, meditation is an escape from everyone and everything around us?
First, I'll say I just did a online retreat for activists and political workers in Massachusetts. So, and that morning I thought, okay, you know, what do I say and what do I emphasize? And I thought, you know, who they remind me of more than anybody is the caregivers, front lines of suffering, immense frustration, trying to deal with seemingly intractable systems, you know. So it was sort of an interesting correlation. And yes, I mean, I think meditation can be seen that way, not perhaps so much from an internal experience of it, because I think one of the things you realize is that escape is not in the cards. You know, it's like that there's a tremendous kind of highlighting of everything we feel and everything we fear and hope for, and all kinds of things. And that's part of the beauty of it, is just being able to hold a huge range of experience, painful and beautiful, in a different way. You know, we don't escape painful recognitions in meditating. We often wish we could, you know, but it's not really like that. And I've seen how much I use it these days, those skills or those tools, in being able to sit with incredible fear or anguish or whatever may be arising, and avoid the two extremes of either drowning in it and being defined by it, or shunning it and trying to push it away. I've also seen how, you know, we can have a pretty distorted relationship to joy, to wonder, to beauty. We can either be so distracted we don't even take it in, or We feel we don't deserve it. And, there's just too much pain, or it's not good enough. It doesn't meet our impossible standards, or whatever it might be. And meditation has helped me with that as well. So I understand people's image of it as a sort of this dreamlike, passivity, but I think that's not the actual experience. And so it depends on if somebody is interested in making the experiment or not. And I see it as an experiment. It's not going to be talked through in some way. Maybe it could be modeled by different people, and certainly there are people, the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh are people who are obviously fueled by a different kind of energy. But really, it's just an experiment if somebody wants to undertake it.
I've heard activists and citizens who may not be activists or organizers talk about how we're dealing with multiple pandemics right now. There is the health one manifested by COVID. There is the persistent and centuries-long racial one in the United States. There is an economic one, which may be hitting at the end of this month with the prospect of millions of people being evicted from their homes and being unable to make even the most basic payments. We've talked a little bit about COVID and health, but one of the emotions that you saw on the streets in the protests was anger, rage, a sense of profound grievance around a wrong that happened not just to one man, George Floyd, one woman, Breonna Taylor, but to countless others when the video camera wasn't on. Say a little bit about anger, especially as a practitioner of loving kindness, and where that, how do you reconcile that?
Well, it's a powerful question, and it's very interesting. One of the people that I interviewed for the book was this woman, Chantel, who's one of the leaders of the striking fast food worker movement. And one of the things I learned from her, got reinforced from meeting her and listening to her speak, and then from the interview, was how much the core of love for oneself in the rightful way, not in an entitled or self-righteous way, but that sense of one's innate worth, one's innate dignity, was at the basis of a movement like that. Because he was somebody who every story society told about her was that she was lesser than. And her family, as one example, or I've met other people in that movement, their families often say, don't rock the boat. You have almost nothing. If you stand up, you're going to have absolutely nothing. Just be calm, but there's something in them that is not hatred, but it's real respect for themselves that has them rise up and say, no, I shouldn't be treated this way. No one should be treated this way, because it doesn't become self-referential. It becomes the basis for caring for others. And so she says things like, I think about the younger generation coming up in these jobs. If I don't try to do something, what's it going to be for them? And I also have a lot in the book about the AIDS crisis and ACT UP and people protesting, and screaming, this is wrong. So even from the Buddhist point of view, where anger is not usually held up as, a glorious thing, there is, even in that psychology, a recognition of the energy of anger being very positive, that it defines a sense of integrity, and, this is wrong. And often, just in ordinary conversation or meetings, say, when we used to have them, it would be like the angriest person in the room who would point out the truth that no one else wanted to look at. And everyone else is even studiously looking the other way, and they're going, look at that flaw, look at that problem. So there's a cutting through energy of anger that's very positive. But the burning and the kind of damage to oneself, if we don't just feel it, but we're defined by it, we're overcome by it, we're sort of determined by it, that's a different thing. And so the very delicate task, even in meditation parlance, is to capture the energy of it and use it, utilize it. And so that's a process, but it's actually possible. And, so I hear stories about the protests in New York City, say, and I have a rented apartment in New York City, which I haven't seen since March 14th. And MSNBC set up their camera crew right across the street. And so a lot was happening on that corner, and I'd see protests and I'd see arrests, and I'd see, and I'd like, oh, there's my window. And I hear all the time, people brought hand sanitizer for others. People wore masks. People were trying to take care of one another. And so even with that anger, which was important, the energy, people were conscious, of compassion and trying to help. And I think it's a more sustainable movement in the end, which is very important.
When I, obviously with Congressman Lewis passing away, I've just been hearkening back to the entire approach to change, rooted in a deep sense of love and compassion and expressed through nonviolence, with, I think, an understanding and an appreciation of the persuasion, the opening up of someone's eyes or heart who may think differently than you or may not even be thinking about that at all, and the possibility of affecting change via that route that can be channeled by anger, but then directed in a positive way. Now, one of the stories both about Mandela and Lewis that I'd love for you to speak to from a perspective of loving kindness and change is Mandela talking about the friendship he had with his jailers. Congressman Lewis talking about the forgiveness of the people who beat him and harmed him. One of the moments I will never forget from my time working for President Obama in the White House, Sharon, was prior to the president going to speak at the funeral and then singing Amazing Grace. A few days before, we saw at the court arraignment for the young man who murdered those individuals while they were worshiping, each member of the family standing up and saying, I forgive you, I love you. And just being overwhelmed with, even as I just said that right now, how that felt. In a moment of rage, in a moment of anger, in a moment of righteous feeling, how do you not turn that into hatred towards or characterizations of or assumptions about motives and intent that may or may not be there, but how do you navigate that, Sharon?
Well, to some extent, I think it's a question of timing, because, and this is also in my book, interestingly enough, I was talking to Tim DeChristopher, who is an environmental activist, and we got into this conversation kind of about this, and he was saying he was in jail for an act of civil disobedience for a couple of years, and then he went to Harvard Divinity School, and so he was talking about his vision of a compassion corps, and basically the conversation was, if you've been harmed, especially grievously harmed, it's not the time necessarily to be thinking about your job is to survive. Your job is to see a sense of meaning in your life. Your job may be to care for your family, or, and maybe it needs to be someone else's job to kind of view the perpetrator with an eye not of making an excuse. Of course, it brings up very big questions of what does forgiveness mean? What does compassion mean? It's never making an excuse or saying something didn't matter, but really having a sense of, is there redemption? Is there something that is possible for this person? And so I thought that was very interesting. Like, maybe it's not your job, right now. Your job in some ways has always got to be some loving kindness for yourself, because it's out of that, if you are not only bearing the pain of what happened, but if you are just like constantly obsessed with the wrongdoing of somebody else, so that your whole life energy is now given over to it, you are suffering mightily, and I had the thought when I was writing the book, I want to quote Gandhi, who said something like, and I'll extrapolate the way I hear the quote, something like, if you're lost in anger, so that means not just feeling anger, but if you're overwhelmed and chronically overwhelmed by it. So if you're lost in anger, it's like drinking poison, thinking it's going to kill the other guy. So because I wanted to use it in the book, I had to source it, so I kept looking it up, and I didn't see it attributed to Gandhi ever. I saw it attributed to the Buddha and Oprah Winfrey and the Big Book of AA and, Carrie Fisher. And like, I have no idea who said it, but that's the truth, of course. Something has already been taken from you, and you don't necessarily want to give the rest of your life over, to this other person who's committed that act. So, but I hesitate over the idea of a mandate, like, or something that, healing won't happen. I don't think that's true. I think we each find our own way in those circumstances, but it has to do with connection, even if it's just connection with your family, something like that.
Right. And as we think about the other, another type of pandemic, or at least another ailment, which is why your book is so important and timely, Sharon. We're a few months, when this is as it's being recorded, from an election in the United States. And one of the data points that just always makes me stop and gives me pause is the fact that 2/3 of Republicans believe that Democrats, not elected officials, but people, are a threat to the Republic. 2/3 of Democrats believe that Republican people are a threat to the Republic. And that level of intensity certainly is going to ratchet up day by day by day by day up until November 3rd. And the reality is, on the morning of November 4th, maybe, there will be half of the country, or a little less than half, who believes that essentially all is lost. There will be another half that will believe that in some ways the opponents have been vanquished and I have won. And there's a deep wound in the body politic that an election doesn't resolve. And so writing the book, thinking about what was about to happen and where we're going into, how should all of us be thinking about our responsibility as citizens who care deeply, will express it whether we vote for this person or that person. But November 4th is a very different day. How do you think about that?
Well, maybe this is part of what I was learning from you in distinguishing my push for voting from citizenship, because I think right now I am so largely committed to engagement. I mean, it's one thing to stand back and say whatever, but it's another thing to really do everything you can to see the result you hope for, because it matters to people. I was talking to somebody, I guess almost 4 years ago. Their son was turning 18. I got really excited. I said, "Oh, you can vote." And there was just like silence at the table. And then I was talking to the dad later, and he said, well, we don't vote. So, and I said, what do you mean you don't vote? And he said, well, candidates are kind of the same. People wouldn't always say that in every election year, but, they're kind of the same, that big difference. And I said, you may only see marginal differences between these candidates, but a lot of people live in those margins.
Yeah.
The difference in, thinking of Chantel, the difference in minimum wage may not mean much to you, but it means everything to other people. And, there are a lot of people who live there. So I actually think, I'll have a different kind of compulsion on November 4th, which is, moving on from engagement or voting to citizenship, because it's amazing to me, even looking at my life at this point, how non-inclusive it is. I was recording one of my own podcasts, and I had this guest on who was talking about people who were infuriated at the slogan Black Lives Matter. And it just gave me pause. And I said to her, what do you think they hear? Do they hear only Black Lives Matter, which would be a big misunderstanding and something that, one could converse about or communicate, hopefully in a really sincere way with, or are they upset because even Black Lives Matter? And then that's a bigger problem. That's a very different thing. And she said she thought they hear even Black Lives Matter, and that was unacceptable. But not everyone may feel that, and so I realized I don't have that conversation with anybody. It's interesting. So I'll feel it, I think, a different sense of responsibility once everyone's voted.
Yeah, no question about it. Sharon, in the as we begin to wrap up this conversation, and there will be many more. When you began teaching, and I'll let you date it, I won't. Did you imagine where loving kindness, where meditation, where mindfulness would be here in the United States, and this moment that we're in? Was it even in the depths of your imagination that we would be here today? And if it wasn't, why do you think that is?
I began teaching in 1974. I was 21 years old. And I don't think any of us had both. We were all kind of young, and we didn't have that sense of vision, and it would have been not the vision anyway, because so few people were interested in meditation at all, let alone something like loving kindness. But I think a lot of it is John Kabat-Zinn. I really think of him as one of the translators of old, who would take the teachings into some foreign land and express it in the idiom of the land. And he did exactly that. And the science, the research, the relanguaging, certainly in terms of mindfulness. My first book was called Loving Kindness. It came out 25 years ago. They reissued it just now for its anniversary. So even in those 25 years, that particular form or methodology has just gotten really an explosion of interest. And there's a lot more research being done with that. And it's kind of moving in a way that it didn't used to, in terms of people undertaking it. And partly it's our world, it's like, I wrote a book after Loving Kindness called A Heart as Wide as the World, which originally had another title, and I asked for it to be A Heart as Wide as the World. So then they had to redesign the cover, which they had some other title in mind. And one of the photos, this was a long time ago, they sent me by mail of a possible cover was like this Van Gogh print with big yellow sky with a few crumbled huts in the bottom, and it looked like a world of total desolation. And so I showed it to a friend, and she said, "This looks like a world that could use some love." And it didn't become the cover, but that phrase has stayed with me for decades. This looks like a world that could use some love, and it really does.
Yeah. In a conversation that I recently had with Diego Perez, and I asked him why he's hopeful. And essentially he said, Sharon, there are more modalities right now than there have ever been in human experience for people to learn how to be with their mind, and to deal with their thoughts and their emotions and their passions and their delusions. And when I think about your work since 1974 and contributing to all of these tools that people have, it makes total sense that real change now is a way to say, okay, now how do we as a collective body do the things that we need to do to make the world that we're living in a little bit better? And it's really, really powerful. What makes you hopeful?
I think the goodness that I see, like the stories of, I think it was Minnesota, this school, which have been feeding people in the community, put out a call for they needed 8 bags of food, and they got literally like 20,000 people just dropped off, bananas or milk or whatever, and I just think, look at that, if we can find each other on that level, so much could happen, and it gives me a lot of hope.
Sharon, as always, such a pleasure to be with you. I look forward to many, many future conversations. And then once again, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Wisdom 2.0 and the entire universe of people who are part of this community, as John would say, a deep bow of gratitude to you for the work you have done and for what you continue to do. So, Sharon, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Talk soon.